What is up, Cool Kids Club? This is Joey here with Youngster Joey Videos. So welcome to episode 1 of our newest Yu-Gi-Oh series, Archetypes Answered. In each episode of this series, we will take a deep dive look into a different Yu-Gi-Oh archetype. Today, we will take a look at a fan favorite archetype, Invoked. The most important card of this archetype is Aleister the Invoker himself. There are 12 main cards to the Invoked archetype. They all center around Aleister the Invoker. Aleister is also related to the Spellbook Prophecy and Magistus archetypes, but more about that later. Aleister revolves around fusion summoning the Invoked Extra Deck Monsters. His main effect, which he is normal summon or flip face up, the player can add the Invocation spell card to the hand. He can also be discarded from the hand in order to increase the attack and defense of a fusion monster by 1,000. The second very important card in the Invoked archetype is the previously mentioned spell card, Invocation. This is the main way the Invoked fusion monsters are special summoned. Invocation allows you to fusion summon a fusion monster using the material in your hand identical to polymerization. However, when you are fusion summoning an Invoked monster, you can also banish cards from your field or either player's graveyards as material for the summon. The final effect is perhaps the most important. When this card is in the graveyard and there's an Aleister Invoker in the banish zone, like there would be if you used Invocation on Aleister either in your field or in your graveyard, then you can shuffle Invocation back into the deck and add Aleister back to your hand. This effect allows you to use the same combo with normal summoning Aleister and then going into fusion summon again on your next turn. Aleister is also back in your hand in case you need to use its discard effect to increase your fusion monster's attacks. There's one more card that gets a lot of play in the Invoked archetype in the main deck, and that is the field spell Magical Meltdown. Magical Meltdown has two effects. The first effect allows you to search and add an Aleister the Invoker card to your hand on activation. This, along with terraforming, allows you to essentially place 7 copies of Aleister in your deck at any time. The second effect of Magical Meltdown protects your fusion summons activations from being negated. This is obviously a positive effect. However, the main thing it does not do is protect your fusion spells from a popular hand trap, Ash Blossom. That means if you're trying to activate Branded Fusion, Red Eyes Fusion, Fusion Destiny, Shaddoll Fusion, or any other fusion card to send cards from the deck, Ash Blossom can still negate the effect. This is because Ash Blossom does not negate the activation of a card, which is what Magical Meltdown protects. There are 2 other main deck cards, but like I said, they're not used quite as often, but they do directly support the Invoked archetype, and they are called Book of Law and Omega Summon. Neither of these cards see much play, but Book of Law allows you to tribute one Invoked fusion monster and switch it for another one. Not a bad effect, but normally not very necessary. Omega Summon has never actually been in a topping deck according to Yu-Gi-Oh top decks, but it allows you to special summon banished invoked monster in defense position. Now it's important to note that neither one of these cards can be used on Aleister the Invoker itself because Aleister Invoker is not an invoked card specifically. Only the fusion monsters count for these 2 cards, which is probably why they don't see very much play. Okay. So now it's time to look at the extra deck monsters. These are the main reasons why you would play the Invoked engine. First, we have likely the most popular Invoked fusion monster, Invoked Mechaba. Invoked Mechaba can be fusion summoned using Aleister the Invoker and 1 light monster. Since light and dark monsters are the 2 most popular types of Yu-Gi-Oh monsters, oftentimes Mechaba can be summoned using your opponent's graveyard along with the Aleister on your field or in the graveyard. Even when you are going first, the Psy-Frame Gear cards are light, as well as another popular hand trap, Effect Veiler. That allows you to use your opponent's graveyard to summon Mechaba. Another popular way to fusion summon Invoked Mechaba is by linking off the Aleister the Invoker. You can either link it off for Artemis, the Magistus Moon Maiden, or for Salamangreat Almiraj, and then secure Gardna on top of that. Either way, you are left with a light monster on field and an Aleister in your graveyard that you can use Invocation on to bring out Mechaba. Now, other than being relatively easy monster to fusion summon, what makes Invoked Mechaba the most popular Invocation target? Well, it's the effect, of course. It's a 2500 attack point monster who can negate any 1 card activation by discarding a card. This Omnigate is very powerful, but does require you to discard the same type of card whose effect you are negating. So if you're negating a monster effect, you discard a monster. If you're negating a trap, you discard a trap, and a spell for a spell. In today's meta, a monster negate alone is very powerful, and also summoning Mechaba, you just so happen to be able to recycle the Aleister the Invoker in your hand to pay for its negate if necessary, although that would ruin your ability to recycle Invocation the next turn, so it'd be better to try to discard a different monster. Lastly, since Mechaba itself is a light monster, as long as you're able to normal summon Aleister the next turn, if your opponent is able to destroy your Mechaba, you are able to recycle it and summon another Mechaba on the next turn using the Mechaba in your graveyard. Okay, so secondly, we have another fusion monster that tends to be fairly easy to summon using your opponent's graveyard. That would be Invoked Kaliga. Now, Kaliga needs Aleister the Invoker and a dark monster as fusion material. Like I already mentioned, dark is an incredibly popular type, so it's almost always a live target using either your opponent's or your graveyard. There's unfortunately not a Dark Link 1 monster that can use Aleister as material, so it may be less live on turn 1 compared to Mechaba, like previously mentioned. Kaliga, though, has the effect that limits both players from activating more than one monster effect per turn, and keeps both players from attacking more than once per turn as long as it's on the field. With 1800 defense, or 2800 defense if you discard Aleister the Invoker, Kaliga can be very difficult for some decks to beat over without a whole lot of monster effects. Even if your opponent can beat over Kaliga, that normally limits them to doing most of their plays in main phase 2, as opposed to main phase 1 and then going into battle phase. Thirdly, we have one of my personal follow-up invoked monsters. It is especially useful in a pure fusion deck when Aleister is combined with cards like Branded Fusion or Shazal Fusion or any of those other fusion monsters and fusion cards listed earlier. This card is called Invoked Agaites. I apologize if I butchered that pronunciation. There are a lot of weird names in the invoked archetype. Now, Agaites is a little harder to bring out on the first turn, since it does require Aleister the Invoker and another fusion monster as its material. However, I believe its effect makes it worth the effort. On its special summon, you can target one monster your opponent controls and destroy it. Then, once per turn, on top of that, any other time a monster is special summoned, it can again target and destroy a monster on your opponent's field. It's a great way to disrupt your opponent's plays before they really get started. The final effect of Agaites is not always available, but if you have other fusion monsters in your graveyard, other than the one you use to fusion summon it, you can banish one and have Agaites gain that banished monster's attack until the end of your opponent's turn, not the end of this turn. So with some setup, you can summon this monster and destroy your opponent's threat on the field, and then attack directly for over 4,000 attack. Okay, so we got to speed this up a little bit here. So next we have a pretty simple one, Invoked Regen. It requires Aleister the Invoker as a fusion material along with a wind monster. Its effect then allows you to once per turn, as a quick effect, book a moon one monster on either side of the field. One of the biggest benefits of this card is that it's a wind monster. In today's meta, Fluanderies is a powerful budget deck that can be very hard to beat. They often end with boards with a barrier statue of Stormwind, which locks both players into only special summoning wind monsters. Again, if you're playing Fluanderies, obviously you have a lot of other things you're going to have to deal with, but if you are able to special summon this card and then flip down their barrier statue or maybe flip down their little penguin card, at least that gives you a little bit of options that you are able to start to take over, even if they have a lot of other things that they can do against you. Okay, so the fifth fusion monster we are going to talk about kind of stings. If you're using Invoked as a part of a bigger build, you likely would not maybe play this one or the next few. But if you are playing a pure Invoked deck, having a fusion monster of each archetype can be useful so that regardless of what deck your opponent is playing, you always have live targets using their graveyard. Okay, so the fifth one is Invoked Purgatrio. Like all the fusion monsters so far, it requires Aleister the Invoker, and this one requires a fire monster alongside it. Purgatrio has 2300 attack and 2000 defense, and can be fusion summoned against a Salamangreat player, or using the Amirage in your own deck if you have the extra deck space to link off Aleister with it. It also can be fusion summoned using the very popular hand trap Ash Blossom, so it's at least easy to bring out. It has the often lackluster effect to gain attack based off the number of monsters your opponent has, and then attack each monster once each. This card can be useful in Duelings and definitely has a positive effect that can help you go for game or clear a board and your opponent has a bunch of weaker monsters. But oftentimes its effect is just not strong enough to actually be useful. Wait, did someone say Duelings? Next we have two monsters that were very popular and strong in Duelings. Both are still on the limited and forbidden list. First we have the Earth monster Invoked Magalinica. It's vanilla that needs Aleister and one Earth monster to be fusion summoned. Its main draw is that it has 3,000 attack, and in Duel Links that was enough to get it limited to 2. In the actual TCG, it's another card that rarely gets played except as a one-of and pure invoked build just in case you're facing an Earth deck. 3,000 attack special summons are just a little easier to come across in the TCG rather than in Duel Links. The other Duel Links power card is Invoked Cocytus. This monster is actually the only banned fusion monster in Duel Links and has a pretty good effect for both Duel Links and the TCG. Cocytus is fusion summoned with Aleister and any water monster. It's a 6-star monster with 1,800 attack and more importantly 2,900 defense. It can attack while in defense, but it uses the 1,800 attack and damage calculation. Now the effect that made it extra good, especially in Duel Links, is that it cannot be targeted or destroyed by your opponent's card effects. That is basically the same protection as my personal favorite fusion monster, Red Eye's Dark Dragoon. In the TCG, Cocytus can be kaiju'd or their non-targeting banishing effects, or can be sent with Zeus. Or if all else fails, most decks in the TCG can get 3,000 attack point monsters out easily enough to attack over Cocytus even when it's in defense mode. However, as we already mentioned with Magalinica, 3,000 attack point monsters are a little harder to come by in Duel Links. Then kaijus and the other types of removal are also far more rare. I think there's Santa Claus and Lava Golem, but nobody wants to play those. So in conclusion, Magalinica and Cocytus are two powerhouses in Duel Links. Magalinica is fairly useless in the TCG. Cocytus has a powerful effect that, unfortunately, most decks can work around pretty easily. Okay, sadly, we are almost done, but we have one more fusion monster to talk about. This is actually the only fusion monster in the Invoked archetype that does not require Aleister the Invoker. This card is called Invoked Elysium. Elysium requires 2 extra deck monsters as its fusion material. More specifically, it requires 1 invoked monster and 1 monster on the field that was special summoned from the extra deck. One of the biggest draws of the fusion spell Invocation, besides the fact that it can recycle every turn, is that it uses monsters from both graveyards. Invocation can still be used for this monster, and it can banish an invoked monster from your graveyard, but you need a second extra deck monster currently on the field to bring it out. You can fusion summon 2 monsters on the same turn using Invocation, since its recycling effect is once per turn, and you can link off Aleister like some of its previously mentioned strategies with Almirage or Magistus Moonmating, but this can be a little clunky and makes Elysium very tricky to bring out on turn 1. Now, is Elysium at least worth all the trouble? Well, maybe. Elysium is a 3,200 attack and 4,000 defense point monster, so it definitely has the best stats of any invoked monster. It also counts as a dark earth, water, fire, wind, and light monster while face up on the field. This effect, to be all typings, has some weird applications, but most importantly, it is useful for Elysium's second effect. Elysium can banish 1 invoked monster on your field or in your graveyard and then destroy all monsters your opponent controls in the same attribute. Since Elysium itself is all attributes, except Divine Beast, it can Regeki the field by banishing itself, as long as you are not playing an Egyptian God deck. Now the problem with this effect is that Regeki itself is legal at 3 right now. If you want to Regeki your opponent's field, just play Regeki. It's a lot fewer steps. In theory, you do not have to banish Elysium itself. If this is a few turns in the game and you are playing a mono-type deck, you likely already use their graveyard to bring out an invoked monster on the same type as them. Then you can banish the invoked monster in your graveyard to Regeki their board and then attack for 3,200 points directly. However, this again is a lot of setup for a card that likely won't accomplish much more than Regeki or a Lightning Storm, which again are both already legal at 3. Now we do have one more monster we're going to talk about. It's just not a fusion monster. This is the final extra deck card and is the only one, like I said, that's not a fusion monster. That's because it's just Aleister. Well, kind of. That's right, we're talking about the Link monster, Aleister the Invoker of Madness. While on the field or graveyard, this becomes Aleister the Invoker, so it can easily be used as material for the 7 powerful fusion monsters we already mentioned, all of them except Elysium. If you fusion summon a monster while this card is on the field, you can add another Invocation to your hand, or add a copy of the Book of Law, that was the other spell card we mentioned earlier, that basically lets you switch out which fusion monster you want to play with. The other effect of Invoker Madness is that this card leaves the field because in an opponent's card effect, you can add 1 Omega Summon to your hand. That's the trap card we mentioned earlier. Now, the Book of Law has at least been used some competitively, but according to Yu-Gi-Oh! Top decks, like I mentioned earlier, Omega Summon has literally never been in a deck that topped an event, so this effect is probably useless. Invoker Madness, again, is a pretty good card that can help you bring out multiple fusion monsters on the same turn and can even facilitate some Elysian shenanigans if you so desire. But I'd stick to probably bringing out Kaliga and Kaliga with it instead. Kaliga can negate the first monster effect on the turn, and then Kaliga can keep the opponent from activating a second. Again, can be a pretty good play and does definitely see some competitive play. Okay guys, so that's the entirety of the Invoked archetype. I hope you enjoyed this type of video. We will definitely take some other deep dives into some other archetypes in the future. Thank you guys so much for watching. Bye.
Go fast, makes me feel